Joined now by Father Frank Brennan, Jesuit priest, Professor of Law and Rector at Newman College in Melbourne University. Father Frank, thanks for your time. You were also on that review, that panel with Philip Ruddock a few years back now, looking at whether Australian law adequately protected the human right to freedom of religion. We're now a few years down the track, still no significant change on that front.
Yes, there are two separate issues we looked at, Kieran. The first was the need for what you might call some slight tweaking of things like the Sex Discrimination Act. What your viewers would be aware of is when you don't have a Religious Discrimination Act, then when you're dealing with religious freedom, in the past it's usually been done by way of exemptions or exceptions in a Sex Discrimination Act. And as there'd been a change in community thinking, there was seen to be a need for some tweaking of that. But then the second and major point is because Australia doesn't have a national Bill of Rights of any sort, we Australians have done a pretty good job of legislating anti-discrimination laws in order to honour our international obligations. So we have those laws in relation to sex, age, and issues of that sort. And so we saw that there was a lacuna in relation to religious discrimination. So the Ruddock Committee basically recommended a religious discrimination bill that was, as I say, attractive to the Morrison wing of the Liberal government, but not very attractive to the Turnbull wing. Whereas where we said there was a need for tweaking of the provisions of the Sex Discrimination Act, that was quite attractive to the Turnbull wing, but not so attractive to the Morrison wing. So there's been a lot of internal Liberal Party politics on this matter.
Now, with this bill back before Parliament, final 2 sitting weeks of the year, I've read your analysis in Eureka Street today, which says basically there is no way the Senate will pass this bill before the next election.
Well, we know from when Christian Porter was Attorney General that he'd had a lot of detailed consultations with what you might call some of the more conservative religious groups, and they had wanted what they called a Religious Freedom Act. Now, on the Ruddock Committee, we were opposed to that, not because we were opposed to a National Human Rights Act, some of us would support that, but given we don't have that, we thought that religious issues should be dealt with in the same way as matters to do with sex, gender, age, disability, and so you'd have a discrimination bill. Well, what Mr Porter then looked at was what you might call a discrimination plus bill, adding in extras to deal with the Israel Folau case and his conflict with Rugby Australia, the Archbishop Porteous case and his conflict with the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner in Tasmania. Now, when Mr Porter was proposing those sorts of things, we know that Senator Patrick and Senator Lambie on the crossbench in the Senate made it clear they weren't much interested in that sort of thing. So anything additional to what I would just call a simple, lean, clean religious discrimination bill, I don't think is going to attract the crossbenchers in sufficient numbers for the coalition to get it up. So what they need is something which is a lean, clean religious discrimination bill which can be attractive to the Labor Party, and then hopefully it could be supported on a bipartisan fashion, whether before or after the next election.
So, OK, if you have a bill which is lean, as you say, lean and clean without any add-ons or amendments to deal with specific cases like the Folau case, for example, then you're more likely to have legislative success.
Far more likely, because when Mr Porter attempted those add-ons, the Australian Human Rights Commission, I think, gave very wise advice and said, look, you don't add in bits to legislation which deal just with one particular case. You've got to get the principles right in discrimination law. So let's get the principles right. And I think the basic principle is not so much in terms of whether or not religious people will discriminate against gays, which was the issue during the same-sex marriage debate. That's not the issue at all. The issue is about what sort of licence do you give to religious groups in order to be able to maintain their religious ethos, particularly when they're running educational institutions, Kieran. And I've always thought the nicest instance we heard during the Ruddock inquiry was from a group who ran a fairly evangelical Pentecostal sort of school. Not the sort of school that I as a Catholic priest would be involved in, but we've got to make place for everyone in our community. Now, when a group like that comes before you and says, well, look, some are saying that you'd only allow religious liberty for the choice of a headmistress or for a religion teacher. But these people said to us, no, what we do is we try and create an atmosphere in our school where there's a good environment, because religion is caught, not taught. So they say, if, for example, we've got a very evangelical gardener, why can't we have a preference for employing the evangelical gardener? It's got nothing to do with sexuality or whether or not you're married or not or things like that, but rather, can't we just do what politicians do in their own offices, where they're given a legislative exception which allows them to employ people of their political beliefs? Then why can't religious educators employ people in good faith who have their religious beliefs, whether or not they're a gardener or a maths teacher or whatever? Because you'll appreciate, even in some more mainstream religious schools, say Catholic schools with which I'm more familiar, you might, for example, have a maths teacher. Now, there will be some secularists who will say, oh, well, teaching mathematics has nothing to do with religion. Well, that ain't quite right, because if you're in a religious school, you may want your maths teacher to offer a brief prayer before the maths lesson begins. So if that's the case, why can't you have a preference for the religious maths teacher rather than the atheist maths teacher? They're the sorts of questions that confront us with what I would call a lean, clean religious discrimination bill.
And it's also an issue, isn't it, at the state level? The Victorian Parliament this week considering the Equal Opportunity Religious Exceptions Amendment Bill of 2021. It's not just a federal issue here. We need to be aware of what's happening at the states. Is the Victorian proposal reasonable?
Indeed. And what we saw with the Ruddock Committee is, as you'd expect, with Ruddock chairing the committee, very respectful of the principles of federalism and that states and territories should be able to do their own thing, but that if they do not measure up to our international obligations, particularly in terms of the respect for religious freedom, then the feds should be free to override any state laws that fall short. Now, with the tweaking of the sex discrimination type provisions, what Victoria has done is to say, well, what we'll do is we will allow the religious school to have a religious preference for a particular teacher where that teacher's role is an inherent function of the school and where it's reasonable and proportionate. Now, as you'll appreciate, Kieran, the average teacher doesn't have an idea what those things mean. That's the sole preserve of Victoria's very specialised quasi-judicial political institutions and judiciary to determine what's reasonable, what's proportionate, what's inherent. Now, the Victorians, with a bit of a try-on, have said, well, look, Tasmania's had a similar law for 10 years. Well, it hasn't. Tasmania's had a law which is very clear, which would allow for the employment of the evangelical gardener. The question unanswered in Victoria is, with the amendments being proposed in Parliament today, would you be allowed to employ the evangelical gardener rather than the atheist gardener? The answer being, well, once you've been to the Victorian Supreme Court and had a determination on what's reasonable, what's proportionate and what's inherent, we'll be able to give you an answer. Well, there'll have been a lot of roses grown and cut by the time that's answered.
Father Frank Brennan, great to get your insights as always. We'll stay in touch as we monitor the progress of this latest iteration of the bill as it goes to the federal parliament. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Kieran. Good to be with you.